Hello, church. It's Pastor Alex back with another reflection. One of the conversations we've been having ongoing is about the Apostle Paul. And so last week and also tomorrow, we will be talking about the life and works of Paul and his impact upon the New Testament and how we've come to know the Christian church as it is today. And if you don't know much about Paul, he wrote a good chunk of the New Testament, probably was the author of the overwhelming majority of the letters that are in there. And he was a person that had a lot of interesting things happen to him. He started out as a great enemy of the church and had a conversion moment on the road to Damascus when an angel of the Lord appeared to him, and he had a change of heart and a change of mind. And ultimately wrote to each different church that we have in the New Testament. So to the church of Rome, he wrote the epistle to the Romans, and the church at Philippi, the Philippians. You guys get the idea. And Paul wrote all of these things to a particular context with a particular reason. And knowing that sometimes it's difficult to get to the bottom of who he was just because he had different things to say to different situations. And so one of the questions that came up in our studies is, if you want to get to know Paul, which of the letters is most accessible? And if you're interested in that, the shortest letter and one that has kind of an interesting backstory is the letter to Philemon, which is about halfway through the New Testament, maybe even a little bit farther than that. So if you look up the book of Philemon, it's a letter that Paul wrote specifically to one person, which is also unique. And it was about one situation. And it's very brief, but you can kind of get a sense of Paul's personality from it. And so what had happened is this guy named Philemon was head of the church at the Colossians at Colossae, and he was an important rich person who had a slave named Onesimus. And we don't know quite what happened, but Onesimus ends up running away. We think probably he'd stolen something or somehow wronged Philemon. Just a quick word, slaves in the ancient world were not quite what you'd imagine like slaves in the American South. They were probably closer to like what we would consider indentured servants. Still not a good thing, but definitely a little bit different than you might be thinking. So Onesimus has run away from Philemon and somehow comes into Paul's orbit and becomes a follower of Christ. And so Paul sends this letter back to Philemon, asking for him to accept Onesimus back and forgive him. And on top of that, not only to forgive him, but to treat him as though he's Paul himself, to treat him like a brother in Christ. And in the letter, Paul has a couple of double entendres that can't be picked up in English. At one point, he says, if he has owed you anything, charge it to my account. And at another point, he says, I am just an old man. And if you're a fan of the Greek, the word there is presbytos, which is where the Presbyterians get their denominational name. And one way to translate it is, I'm an elder, like a powerful person, but it could also be translated, I'm just an old man. And so you get a sense of Paul. Is Paul being a little bit passive aggressive here? It's open to interpretation. But what we do see is theology in action. So Paul's beliefs were that in Christ we are all of us made equal, that there's neither Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free, and he takes that literally, and he reminds Philemon that if he sees Onesimus as a brother in Christ, he will not have him punished as was his legal right. And again, if you were a runaway slave in the ancient world, you could be imprisoned, you could be beaten. It was not a good situation. So if you're looking for a quick way to read an entire letter that Paul wrote, that Philemon is one place to start. If you're looking for a way of understanding the entirety of his thought, there's no better place to turn than Romans. And if you're looking for something that's in between, one of the books that I like a lot is his letter to the church in Galatia, to the letter to the Galatians. And each of these has something different to teach, and the more time you spend reading them, the more you'll get to know Paul and some of his greatness as well as some of his foibles. And much of the New Testament was his words written by letter to a specific time and a specific place. If you're interested in learning more, join us tomorrow on Zoom. We'll have another session on the life of Paul and what that looks like. And if you ever have Bible questions or anything like that, please do reach out and let me know. I'd be happy to address them, whether in this format or by phone or whatever you have on your hearts and minds. I hope in the midst of the coronavirus that peace is holding you fast and you are in my prayers. And if I can be of help, let me know. So God bless and have a good night.